Alright folks, it's happened. Someone has finally sent me a monitor to review. And as you've no doubt discerned from the title of this video, Lenovo was kind enough, and I guess brave enough, to send out their Legion Y27q-20 for review. So let's get right into it. The Y27q-20 is a 27-inch, QHD, 165Hz extended gamut nano-IPS monitor that's G-Sync compatible. And at around $470, if you can find one in stock, it's squarely competing with other high-end 144 to 165Hz displays like the Asus VG27AQ, LG's 27GL850, Dell's S2721DGF, and even, I suppose, ViewSonic's too expensive XG270QG. Now, you may have caught this when I said nano-IPS, but the Y27q-20 does indeed share the same LG panel as those three latter monitors. Of those, I've only reviewed the XG270QG, but I found it handily beats my VG27AQ's response times, and, spoiler for this review, the Lenovo also beats the poor Asus. But perhaps a more interesting comparison is between the Y27q-20 and the two ultra-high refresh rate 240Hz plus Full HD monitors I've reviewed recently, the ViewSonic XG270 and the Asus VG279QM. Surely those 1080p guys perform better than the QHD Lenovo, right? You may be surprised, but we'll get there. LG's nano-IPS panel inside the Legion also gives it the same extended 98% P3 coverage as the 27GL850 and XG270QG, with that vivid, beautiful, and brilliant red born from the PFS Phosphor in the backlight. I'll talk more about the extended gamut later on, but unfortunately we pay a price for that amazing red. The PFS Phosphor's slow excitation and decay ruins strobing modes, so Lenovo offers no backlight strobing on the Y27q-20. For a guy who spent, I don't know, roughly 40% of my XG270 review talking about backlight strobing, that makes me a little sad. But Lenovo made the right choice here. There's no reason to include backlight strobing if it's not going to be good. Lenovo isn't offering any RGB lighting here, so I had to add my own. But it's clear they were going for a more subtle and professional look. The stand, which is heavy, has a pretty unique base with circular cutouts and blue accents, and I really like the look of it. But cable management is not as tidy as some other solutions, so the dangling cables will slightly spoil the overall polished look. On the left rear of the panel are the USB ports and headphone jack, but there's also an easy-to-miss headphone hanger. Otherwise, we get the usual swivel, tilt, and rotate options, although, and this is going to sound a little bit picky, because the VESA mount is not centered on the back of the monitor, when you rotate the screen into portrait mode, the whole panel is offset from the stand. That might bother at least one other person on the internet. Inputs are a little bit limited, with only one DisplayPort 1.4 and one HDMI 2.0. OSD navigation is very straightforward, and the brightness setting can be accessed easily with one of the face buttons, which is handy. There's not a lot in the color menu to adjust, but you can modify the color temperature and, importantly for an extended gamut panel, turn on the sRGB mode. But I'll talk about that later. Okay, I normally start these reviews proper by talking about how the screen actually looks, but I need to take a quick detour to talk about a problem with the Y27q-20 that started showing up at least a year ago. Even though the monitor is G-Sync compatible certified, threads started popping up on r/monitors, Nvidia's GeForce forums, and even Lenovo's forums from owners of Nvidia cards complaining about the screen blanking out sporadically in games like Battlefield 5, Overwatch, and Mass Effect Andromeda, usually in menus or loading screens. And these threads and complaints have kept resurfacing throughout the year, even up to last week. Lenovo sent me the Y27q-20 a few weeks back, and unluckily for the both of us, I, with my 1070 Ti, also started getting these blackouts. I first noticed them infrequently in Forza Motorsport 7, but Kerbal Space Program shows them off perfectly. The screen will occasionally blank out so long that it goes into power saving mode. But as I continued testing, I found it happening with more and more games. Quake Live would go black when loading into maps. Skyrim would blank out every time I fast traveled. And with Frog Pursuit, I was able to consistently cause the blackouts by dropping the frame rate down to 10 FPS. Some clever custom resolution utility wizards were able to find a way to stop the blackouts by deleting the monitor's HDMI extension block, but that clearly shouldn't be a thing a user should be expected to do. Without this being fixed, my review would have been very short. Don't buy the monitor. Fast forwarding about 10 days, Lenovo provided me with a beta firmware upgrade, LG 1.3T, compared to the shipping firmware LG 1.1, and after thoroughly retesting all of those same games, I haven't found any instance where the screen blanked out. If you own the Y27q-20 and are eager for a fix, Lenovo says the official firmware is currently undergoing testing and will be out soon. So from my perspective, kudos to Lenovo for working to get this resolved, but that may be little consolation to those of you who own the monitor and have been dealing with the blackouts for a year. But let's finally start getting into some measurements, and we can begin with brightness and contrast. The Y27q-20 has a very good range of brightness adjustment, from 60 nits at the low end to 363 nits max. Lenovo only claims a peak brightness of 350 candela per square meter, which, while not as bright as some of the other monitors I've reviewed that reach 400 plus nits, should be sufficient for most users. I found 180 nits serves as a comfortable middle ground for most viewing conditions, either day or night, so that brightness is my calibration target. Contrast is low, even for an IPS display. I measured a consistent 868:1 across all OSD brightness settings. For those of you who've been following reviews of monitors that share LG's nano-IPS panel, this shouldn't be totally unexpected. The 27GL850, S2721DGF, and the XG270QG all exhibit low contrast ratios. My sample of the XG270QG was particularly bad at only 700:1, so the Lenovo at least does better than that, and I'll show why when we get to backlight bleed. Asus's VG27AQ is a similarly priced QHD competitor to the Y27q-20, and its 1110:1 contrast ratio beats the Lenovo. But how much difference does that actually make? Well, let's put them side by side and find out. For this comparison, I've calibrated both screens to 180 nits peak brightness, and if I turn off the lights, you can't see anything, until I adjust the exposure. So yes, there is a difference between 1100:1 and 870:1, but all of these IPS panels hovering around the 1001 mark are never going to look amazing in the dark. Both screens happily have minimal backlight bleed, but the Lenovo is doing a little worse here. Let's take a closer look. For my uniformity shots, both black and white, I take two exposures. One that attempts to give a realistic picture of how the display looks to the eye, and one that's exposed to middle gray with a contrast bump. This sample of the Y27q-20 has a bit of bleed in the bottom left corner, but it's not too severe. When I first took the monitor out of the box, the bleed along the bottom edge was pretty apparent, but after a few days the panel mellowed out. The performance here is actually pretty surprising. It could have been much worse. While we're still in the dark, the Y27q-20 will show IPS glow as your viewing angle changes, but it's no better or worse than any of the other IPS displays I've reviewed. But getting back to uniformity, let's jump up to the brighter end. Looking at a full white screen on the Lenovo reveals one of my biggest issues with the monitor. Much like the ViewSonic XG270, the Y27q-20 has dramatic vignetting on the left and right sides of the screen, the top left being especially bad. It doesn't play well on camera, but if I start adjusting the exposure to bring white down, it's easy to spot. Here's the exaggerated version. Calibrated to 180 nits in the center, the right edge is only producing 133 nits, and the top left is way down at 125 nits. This is easily visible in normal content, not just in this exaggerated shot. I've seen plenty of reports of similar vignetting on LG's 27GL850 and Dell's S2721DGF, so that's one big drawback common amongst these panels. Taking a look at the macro shots, there's nothing unusual about the subpixel layout. This is a typical RGB panel. But if I adjust the focus a bit, we get a better look at the anti-glare film, which is one of the best that I've seen. It's light enough to not cause any rainbow speckling or graininess on white backgrounds, and you can even see the filament of my work light in the reflection. This is not quite at the level of a glossy anti-reflective coating, but I think it's a good compromise for most people. One more small issue. As your viewing angle gets more and more extreme, the pixels along the very edges of the panel kind of start to disappear. This is actually not unique to the Y27q-20. Asus's VG279QM has the same issue, and I have a Samsung TV that shows this as well. At normal viewing distances, this is not a problem, but if you're getting your face right up on the screen, you may lose a few pixels on the border. I now want to get back to the Y27q-20's extended gamut and vibrant reds that I mentioned at the beginning of the review. Side by side with an sRGB panel, the difference is remarkable. You can't really see it here. Unfortunately, no one can be told what an extended gamut screen looks like. You have to see it for yourself. Well, here's an attempt. Both the Lenovo and Asus are showing pure red here, but seeing the two side by side really illustrates just how not red sRGB red really is. You may be worried that the extended gamut blows out and unnaturally oversaturates colors, but I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by how the Y27q-20 performs in its native gamut. Let's get into the measurements. Using only the OSD color temperature controls, no software calibration here, I couldn't quite bring the three primaries together throughout the full grayscale range. The best I could achieve was a slightly warm median color temperature of 6,442 Kelvin compared to the target of 6,500 Kelvin. Quite close, but other screens do slightly better. If you were wondering, you can find the settings I used on the text review at aperturegrill.com. The elevated red and green levels above 50% white lead to a steadily increasing delta E as the brightness ramps, but most values are below 2, so the Lenovo performs well here. An average delta E of only 1.3 is a very good result for what can be achieved with just a few OSD modifications. Lenovo doesn't offer any gamma adjustment in the OSD, which is disappointing, but otherwise they've done an excellent job of tracking the sRGB gamma curve. This chart also has the more television-focused BT1886 2.4 gamma as a reference, which is actually my preference. I'm glad Lenovo adhered well to the sRGB spec, but some other options would be nice. The Y27q-20 offers very good coverage of the P3 color space. Lenovo claims 98%, and while I don't have a spectrophotometer to verify that, I'm confident enough in that claim. The green and blue primaries are very close, and there's overcoverage for red. But with almost all content on the internet being developed on sRGB screens, I was worried the Lenovo would give skin tones a hyper-red, sunburned look. But happily, that only occurs a little bit. Only the most saturated colors are extended, but moderately saturated tones are kept well controlled. My measurement software, HCFR, uses the Color Checker Classic patterns to test colors like dark skin, light skin, blue sky, and foliage, and I measured an average delta E of only 2.7 for the Lenovo. Skin tones do look a little punchier than on a standard gamut panel, but nothing is so outrageously inaccurate that you can't just leave the panel in the extended mode all the time, and that would be my recommendation. The extended gamut is really kind of thrilling to see for most content. But if you need to clamp the primaries, there is an sRGB mode in the OSD. Once selected, all color controls are completely locked out, even brightness, which is nuts. At first I thought brightness was completely locked, but if you leave sRGB mode, adjust the brightness, and then go back into sRGB mode, the new brightness will stick. Yikes. That annoyance aside, the sRGB mode does a fantastic job of clamping the primaries to the sRGB spec. But there's one problem here. The white point is too blue, around 6850 Kelvin, which shifts all the saturations and color checker measurements off target, leading to a higher 3.1 delta E average. This would be easy enough to correct with some user color controls, but I get the engineering dilemma here. You can't offer a true sRGB mode if you allow users to monkey around with it, but if you're going to lock everything down, you have to get it right. With the too cool color temperature, grayscale delta E's steadily rise as the percent white increases, leading to a 3.0 delta E average, which is slightly worse than in the unclamped mode. And strangely, the gamma tracking is also worse in sRGB mode than it is in the native mode. So while this mode is not as accurate as I'd like, those delta E's are still quite usable, and I'm very glad Lenovo includes it. I've been switching between sRGB and native frequently while putting this review together to make sure everything I'm showing here looks correct on your, presumably, sRGB screen. Alright, while I enjoy talking about sRGB modes as much as the next guy, it's finally time to move on to my favorite part of these reviews, when I get to pull out the Melexis light probe and start capturing some response time data. I can't cover everything about my new testing methodology in this video, so if you want a very detailed look at how exactly I measure LCDs, check out my 10% to 90% gray to gray video. But let's start with input lag. The waterfall chart I'm showing now shows a uniform distribution of rise times based on a USB key press, and what I'm looking for is the very fastest one, which I can then compare to the fastest response on a CRT. For the Y27q-20, I caught a response at only 2.19 milliseconds, which, after subtracting the 1.58 millisecond response of a CRT, gives an estimated innate lag of only 0.61 milliseconds, which is excellent. Comparing every monitor I've tested so far, there's not a lot between them. Even the worst of the bunch is very good. If you're noticing a lot of latency with any of these, that lag is somewhere else in the chain, and I've also got a video about that. Before I start measuring response times, I like to get an idea of how a monitor's overdrive modes behave in the variable refresh range, and to do so, I use my Frog Pursuit program. Lenovo offers 3 modes for the Y27q-20, Off, Normal, and Extreme. On their site, Lenovo claims a 3 millisecond response time in normal mode, and 1 millisecond in extreme mode. Okay. Let's see how those modes behave at 165 FPS. Off really is off. 0 transitions show overshoot, so we get a glimpse of the panel's native response. The frogs here all have faint color trails behind them, and the RGB traffic lights are a bit smeary. Off is interesting for curiosity's sake, but almost every LCD can be improved with a bit of overdrive, so let me swap over to normal. Normal cleans up the trails nicely, and other than the sample and hold blur, this looks really good. I'll try to quantify just how good in a bit, but let's switch to extreme. While not as completely out of control as the XG270 was at its highest overdrive setting, extreme on the Y27q-20 is useless to the consumer, only serving to technically reach their 1 millisecond claim. And it gets worse at 85 FPS. The longer frame time at 85 FPS causes the overshoot to linger, so we get these ridiculous inverse ghosts. Here's what one of these responses looks like at 85 FPS. The rise from RGB 63 to 159 hits the target not just 10% to 90%, but fully hits RGB 159 in only 1.1 millisecond. So I can say for sure that the Y27q-20 does indeed have 1 millisecond response times. But this transition way overshoots, all the way to RGB 236. And because of that long frame time at 85 FPS, the overshoot isn't corrected until 11.8 milliseconds later, where it finally returns to RGB 159 at 29.5 milliseconds. Check out the CAD in the corner, 389.8. I'll get to that soon. But what about normal at 85 FPS? Still in the variable refresh range, watch as I swap between normal and off. It's much harder here to pick a winner. The Y27q-20 doesn't have any form of variable overdrive, so the same overdrive that worked so well at 165 FPS is now a bit too strong at 85 FPS. But look at the purple frog. Normal, even with the slight overshoot, is clearer than off. I'll leave it up to you to decide which looks better or worse at 85 FPS, but I'm confident enough to say that normal is the ideal overdrive mode for the full variable refresh rate range. Let me show you why. Here are the CAD scores for the 3 overdrive modes plotted across that full range. If you want more details on how I calculate CAD, I covered that in my XG270 review. But shortly, CAD, or cumulative absolute deviation, sums up the area away from a perfect square wave transition. That's why that 85 FPS example earlier with extreme overdrive had such a high CAD. Lower is better. Extreme is obviously nuts, so let's drop that from the chart. I have normal performing better than off at every frame rate, but the scores do nearly converge at 85 FPS. Even with the new CAD overshoot penalty, normal slightly bests off at this low frame rate. That may be a bit unexpected based on the 85 FPS pursuit shot that I showed earlier, but while that lingering overshoot hurts the normal mode score, it's more than made up for with the slightly goosed LCD fall times. Here's an example. On the falling transition RGB 223 to 63, normal overshoots the target of 63, going down to RGB 52. But it gets and stays near the target level faster than the off transition. With overdrive off, the average CAD for all falling transitions is 61.6, slightly higher than the average of 58.7 for normal. If you're very sensitive to overshoot, you may want to swap to off if your games are routinely running between 75 and 90 FPS, but normal is the better mode overall. You can find all the detailed response time measurements on the website. For each refresh rate and each gray-to-gray transition, you can see its CAD, first response, and real or final response time, along with how far the response overshoots. But if that's not enough, you can also download every response time chart that Octave produced for the Y27q-20. With fewer overdrive modes, there are only around 2,000 charts this time. Okay, with normal selected as the ideal overdrive mode, how does the Lenovo compare to the other monitors I've tested? The chart on screen now has the newest CAD data from the monitors I've been able to retest with my new methodology. With the Lenovo added in, I now have new CAD data for 5 monitors: this Y27q-20, Asus's VG27AQ and VG279QM, the LG 24GM79G, and ViewSonic's XG270. The first thing to note is just how demonstrably the Y27q-20 beats the VG27AQ. The Asus was never a super fast QHD screen, but LG's nano-IPS panel is much faster. But look at the Lenovo in red. It's hanging with the 2 fast 240Hz plus monitors from Asus and ViewSonic. That is incredibly impressive for a QHD screen. At 165 FPS, the Y27q-20 scores on par with the ViewSonic and is only slightly behind the VG279QM. But without any sort of variable overdrive, it does fall a bit behind the XG270 at that 85 FPS mark. For the QHD screens, the comparison is easy. Lenovo's Y27q-20 is better than the VG27AQ. I've grown a bit fond of the VG27AQ since I've owned it for so long, but the Lenovo has much faster response times, a wider color gamut, and a better, clearer anti-glare coating. The VG27AQ has better contrast, fewer uniformity issues, and it does have backlight strobing, but ELMB sync on the Asus was only half or even quarter baked. A more interesting comparison is between the Lenovo and the 2 Full HD panels. The Y27q-20, at around $470, is more expensive than those two, but not by a lot. 240 FPS is a marked improvement over 165. Don't let the human eye can only see 30 FPS crowd tell you otherwise. But having to drop down to Full HD to get there is not ideal. I didn't mention this before, but while I was reviewing the 1080p XG270, my VG27AQ was away being serviced, so I had to do the entire review, image and video editing on the XG270, and it was very frustrating. While I really like both the VG279QM for its 280 FPS and amazing OD120 mode, and also the XG270 for its stellar backlight strobing, the Y27q-20 really puts in perspective how overpriced they are. For most people and most games, the additional frame rate overhead is going to be wasted, and the jump from Full HD to QHD is significant. But before I fully recommend the Y27q-20, I have to go back to those screen blackouts. I've been enjoying the monitor precisely because I have a firmware fix that no one else has, so my recommendation is contingent upon Lenovo releasing that firmware widely and soon. This really shouldn't have taken so long to fix. I'm joining the party late, so I feel for the people who've been dealing with the blackouts since last year. So if you already own the monitor, hang on a bit for the firmware update, which again should be coming soon. But the same holds true if you're considering buying the Y27q-20. Wait for news on the update. So with the VRR Blackouts fixed, the Lenovo is an excellent choice at this price range, as long as you're not a backlight strobing junkie. That's all for this one. I hope you enjoyed watching.